Hey, this is Maroon 5 here to talk about electric vehicles. The group is Roxanne, Charlie, David, Shane, and Michael.
First, let's talk about the history. So the first electric car was made in 1890. Following that, in 1908, Ford came out with the Model T, which came in at a much cheaper price than electric cars at $650. So it kind of put them a little bit lower on the purchase scale or moving forward with other electric vehicles at that time. Other areas to note would be that the Prius was made into mass production, which was the first hybrid in 1997. However, the Honda Insight was the first mass-produced electric car in the United States. At this time, in 2018, 46 battery electric vehicles are capable of highway speed available worldwide, and electric vehicles make up 1.45% of global new auto sales. So what happened to push forward the electric car production if the Model T came out with such a cheaper option for the internal combustion engine vehicles? So first, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a sharp increase in oil prices and shortages. This caused the Electric and Hybrid Vehicle Research, Development, and Demonstration Act of 1976, followed by the 1990 Clean Air Act Amendment and 1992 Energy Policy Act. In 1990, a little-known company named Tesla received $465 million loan from the Department of Energy Loan Office. President Obama signed in 2 acts in order to help push forward research and development of electric vehicles. The first was in 2009, the Recovery Act, which caused an increased investment in nationwide infrastructure, so installing public and private chargers for electric vehicles throughout the United States. The second was in 2012, the initiative called EV Everywhere Grand Challenge. This was put on by the Energy Department to help make plug-in cars more affordable, improvements to the batteries by the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research at Argonne National Laboratory in order to make batteries last longer so that electric vehicles could go farther. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, where they're working on electric vehicle perception, longer battery life again, and then cost-effective materials to be able to push electric vehicles into more of the mainstream. The key players in this landscape are Nissan, Toyota, Volkswagen, GM, Hyundai, Tesla, of course, Ford, BMW, Daimler AG, and Mitsubishi. The key markets are North America, Europe, the Asia-Pacific area, and of course the rest of the world. Asia-Pacific is dominating sales, and North America has a very strong market due to increasing environmental commitments. Europe is forecasted for mass adoption of vehicles in the future. The big push is because automakers at this time need zero-emission vehicles to meet the global emission standards and fuel efficiency. And actually, a lot of research that we found states that they're willing to run their EV portfolios at a loss in order to meet the emission standards. So where do we look at in the near future? In 2018 and 2019, this is what we're heading towards. Volvo plans to introduce green technologies in India by increasing the number of electric vehicle models assembled in India, and Volkswagen will launch an all-electric car sharing platform in Germany.
Now we'll cover the current state of the technology of electric vehicles. So here we can see battery-powered electric vehicle sales for December of last year. These are the 3 dominant markets in the world. China is by far the largest market. They had sales of 83,000 vehicles in just December, followed by the United States with 36,000, and then Europe with 24,000. You can see a good variety of vehicles here. Most of the vehicles sold in China are made by Chinese manufacturers. The United States is dominated by Tesla, and then Europe has pretty good diversity. On this slide, we show the top 3 battery-powered electric vehicles sold worldwide for the year 2018. The number 1 is the Tesla Model 3 overall by far, with over 145,000 vehicle sales. Very impressive, really, because price is quite high compared to most other electric vehicles in the world. And then the second is the BAIC EC series. This is a small city car. It's very popular. It can go up to 75 miles per hour. It's mostly used in China, where roughly 2/3 of the cost is subsidized. And then last, but definitely not least, is the Nissan Leaf. The Leaf has the most cumulative sales of any battery-powered electric vehicle in the world and was third in sales for 2018.
This is David Reinfeld here to cover key considerations. The first key consideration when we're talking about electric vehicles is how we actually measure the environmental impact of them. So when it comes to tailpipe emissions, EVs are certainly cleaner than their gas-powered counterparts. Usually when the comparison's made, it's made between an electronic vehicle and an 20-year-old clunker. But the internal combustion engines have actually come a long way. Regardless, electronic vehicles are still far cleaner when it comes to quote-unquote tailpipe emissions. Now, the interesting thing to think about is this other metric called well-to-wheel. Now, when we think about EVs, is that their emissions basically shift from the car itself to the quote-unquote pump. The challenge here is that your EV is only as clean as the fuel that charges it. Electronic vehicles rely on what's called charging stations. These charging stations basically derive their power from the quote-unquote grid. Now, depending on where you live, the grid can either be very clean or in some places very dirty. When we look at the map, you look at the United States is actually starting to shift its reliance over to natural gas instead of things like coal and nuclear energy, but the majority of the grid is still powered by non-renewable energy sources such as fossil fuels that are bad for the environment. Additionally, the batteries that actually power the electronic vehicles themselves are mostly lithium-ion batteries. Now, while the technology is extremely impressive, the inputs required to actually make these are made from non-renewable resources and scarce metals throughout the world. The mining and smelting of these resources generate high levels of air, soil, and water pollution, and largely, many of these countries are non-US and are some of the most polluted places in the world. When we look at lithium itself, 80% of the world's production is concentrated in Argentina, Australia, Chile, and China. Cobalt, 65% is concentrated in the Congo. Graphite, 65% comes from China. Nickel, India accounts for over 50%, and manganese, over 90%, comes from China, Australia, Gabon, Brasilia, and India.
Well, let's just talk about a few of the other cons to electric vehicles. Cost is definitely one of them. Electric vehicles are more expensive than internal combustion engine vehicles. For instance, the Nissan Leaf starts at about $30,000 before rebates, whereas you could buy a Nissan Versa for about $13,000. The buyers of these electric vehicles are typically wealthier Americans, which the vehicles do have subsidies, so chances are poor people are contributing to those subsidies to pay for vehicles for wealthier Americans, which is unfair. There's also going to be increased load on the grid, which will require utilities to install new solar fields or gas-powered plants, which will increase rates for kilowatt hours. There's the range issue. Range anxiety refers to when people get nervous about being able to make it to their destination and back, or to be able to find electric charging station. The range on electric vehicles is a lot shorter than most gas-powered vehicles. And a BMW i3 can come with only 81 miles of range, whereas some of the Teslas go 300 miles plus. But many hybrid electric vehicles today are able to do 500 miles on a single tank of gas. The other major concern is that of performance for the battery. The batteries do degrade over time. A Nissan Leaf's battery will cost $5,500 to replace, and it might only last you 5 years. Internal combustion engine cars, typically you don't have to replace the engine after 8 years. So there is a higher rate of depreciation on these more expensive vehicles. And that is something to consider other than just the kilowatt hour price versus paying at the pump.
Next, we want to do as true as we possibly could operational comparison between the Tesla Model 3 Performance and the BMW M3. The Model 3 Performance is the top-of-the-line Model 3, and the BMW M3 is the top-of-the-line four-door sedan, the smallest sedan that BMW makes. Both cost about the same amount. The unsubsidized cost for the Tesla is $58,000 compared to the higher $66,000 for the BMW. The Tesla weighs a little bit more. Both are about the same power, and the Tesla is actually faster. Now, what we really want to do is look at the energy and CO2 generation. These numbers here are assuming 13,000 miles a year of driving, 12 cents per kilowatt hour energy cost, $3.20 per gallon of premium gas, and then a 0.33 grid efficiency factor for the Tesla, and a 0.29 engine efficiency factor for the BMW. The total energy cost for the Tesla per year, on average, for an average American, is $508 compared to much higher $2,096 for the BMW M3. Now look at CO2 generation, similar thing. Tesla generates still rather high 9,000 pounds compared to over 15,000 pounds for the BMW. And the total energy used is 12,348 kilowatt hours for the Tesla. That's the equivalent basically to running your dryer 5 times a day, every single day. But the BMW is still much higher at 21,454.
There's a lot of optimism about the future of electric vehicles. Plug-in electric vehicles accounted for 1.5% of car sales in 2018. However, in the coming decades, demand for electric vehicles is going to dramatically increase across the globe. According to a recent report by JP Morgan, market share of plug-in electric vehicles alone are expected to reach 7.7% by 2025. Hybrid vehicles, which only account for about 3% of sales today, will reach 23% of all sales by 2025. Conversely, traditional internal combustion engine vehicles, dominance over the market will diminish. It's expected to have 70% market share in 2025, but that will be reduced to 40% by 2030. Of course, growth prospects vary across the globe. This is largely due to regulatory goals. In the US, for instance, market share will still increase, but not with the same urgency as in the EU or China, where emissions take more of a priority. China is well ahead in the adoption of electric vehicles. The country is expected to drive over 50% of global sales over the next decade. This is largely a result of incentives offered by the Chinese government, such as subsidies, increased infrastructure, and supply of rare earth elements found in China. Additionally, consumer preferences largely ignore some of the limitations of electric vehicles, such as vehicle range and size, which are priorities in the United States. The widespread adoption of electric vehicles is dependent on having the necessary infrastructure. Like gas stations, drivers need an abundance of locations to refuel. According to McKinsey, the US, EU, and China must invest $50 billion by 2030 in chargers alone in order to meet the demand for chargers. That's an increase of 43 million chargers by 2030. As the adoption of electric vehicles increases and the required infrastructure is installed, electric vehicles will begin to account for a substantial proportion of the world's overall electrical energy demand. Currently, that's about 25 terawatt hours, and only a negligible amount is from electric vehicles. This is projected to change dramatically by 2050, and 9% of the total 40 terawatt hour demand will come from electric vehicles alone. Of course, electricity demand and consumption is not the only sustainability issue when it comes to electric vehicles. The demand for lithium-ion batteries will necessitate the demand for precious metals. Thomson Reuters analysis looked at the demand increases in a world with only electric vehicles. Under this extreme case, demand for cobalt would have a 2,000-fold increase and lithium a nearly 3,000-fold increase. Electric vehicles currently account for 15% of lithium demand and that is expected to increase by 40% to 40% by 2025. Resources are further threatened by macroeconomic effects of electric vehicle adoption. On the one hand, energy density of batteries will dramatically increase over the next 2 decades, coinciding with electric vehicle demand. However, as manufacturing reaches scale, production costs will reduce, but the raw material costs will remain constant. A pessimistic forecast by BlackRock estimates that if electric vehicles market share rises to 12.5%, then the global reserves of cobalt will be depleted by 2030. Therefore, in order for electric vehicles to be truly sustainable technology, battery alternatives must be deployed.
All right, so let's talk about some of the new battery technologies that will reduce our dependence on the lithium-ion technology. Right now, Honda's looking at fluoride ion, and there's also a company called Grabit that's doing graphene batteries, and there's also laser-made micro supercapacitors, which are technically not even batteries, and there's foam batteries as well that are under development. All of these battery technologies offer benefits of faster charging or a higher performance for discharging, and with these batteries becoming available in the future, it should make electric vehicles more sustainable. There's other opportunities for electric vehicles to integrate with the electrical grid and rooftop solar. The car could be used as a source of power for the home during a grid outage, for instance. Or the electric vehicle batteries could be used to shave demand charges that utilities charge for customers who have rooftop solar. There's been research done where electric vehicle batteries can see a second life used in the home in a Powerwall configuration, much like what Tesla is offering. And rooftop solar makes it possible for customers to know exactly what energy is being used in their car so they can be sure that it's using carbon-free energy.